history rarely ends with a bang. But on a crisp October morning in 1781, it did. With a calm determination that masked the weight of a revolution on his shoulders, General George Washington personally lit the fuse. A single cannon roared into the Virginia sky. And with that, the Siege of Yorktown began. It wasn't merely an act of war, it was a message, thundered across the Atlantic, aimed squarely at a dying empire. By the time the smoke cleared, an entire British field army had vanished from the American theater, and the world's most formidable empire had been brought to its knees, not in London, not in New York, but in a quiet coastal town in Virginia. Yet this ending was anything but certain. Just months earlier, the cause of American independence teetered on the edge of collapse. Soldiers were starving. Congress was broke. France was hesitant. The revolution, for all its idealism, was in retreat. So how did it end in triumph? Why did a final, desperate campaign succeed, where so many others had failed? And how close did it all come to unraveling? The Siege of Yorktown is more than just a battle. It's the story of timing, deception, risk, and redemption. It was the final gamble, and America went all in. Spring 1781. The American Revolutionary War had been dragging on for 6 brutal years. What began as a defiant stand for liberty had devolved into a war of attrition. The patriotic fire that had once lit town halls and farm fields was flickering. Continental currency had collapsed. The army, unpaid and poorly supplied, stood on the verge of mutiny. Morale was thin. In private, even Washington admitted, "We are at the end of our tether." Meanwhile, the British seemed to be everywhere. Under General Henry Clinton, they held fast to New York City, the strategic jewel of the eastern seaboard. In the South, General Charles Cornwallis had driven American forces from Georgia and the Carolinas and now threatened Virginia with over 7,000 veteran troops. To make matters worse, the American political system, decentralized and disorganized, had little ability to raise new funds or enforce wartime unity. The fate of the revolution rested precariously on a fractured alliance with France and a general whose very patience was being tested by a war that refused to end. Washington's initial hope for the 1781 campaign was bold but logical. Attack New York. With the aid of newly arrived French troops under the Comte de Rochambeau and possibly a French fleet, Washington believed that he could strike at the heart of British command in America. On May 22, 1781, in the quiet town of Wethersfield, Connecticut, Washington and Rochambeau met to chart the future of the war. Rochambeau, the seasoned French general, argued for striking in the South against Cornwallis. Washington, ever obsessed with New York, stood firm, but fate and a certain French admiral had other plans. In mid-August, word arrived that changed everything. Admiral de Grasse, commanding 29 French warships and 200 men, had sailed north from the Caribbean toward the Chesapeake Bay. But his message came with a warning. He would only remain until mid-October. It was the narrowest of windows and the boldest of opportunities. Suddenly, New York seemed unreachable. But Virginia, if Washington could march fast enough, and if de Grasse could block Cornwallis by sea, they might surround and destroy the British in one decisive blow. It was, perhaps, the most important decision of George Washington's life. Should he stay in New York, where his position was strong, or gamble everything in the army? The war, the very revolution, on a rapid strike to the South. He chose to gamble. On the 19th of August, the Allied armies began their march. Over 7,000 0 soldiers. French and American quietly slipped away from New York and began the grueling journey south. Through the heat and storms of the American summer, to protect their ruse, Washington spread false intelligence, forged letters, and feigned preparations to attack Manhattan. It worked. General Clinton, guarding New York, saw nothing. By the time he realized what was happening, Washington was already in motion, a phantom army headed for destiny. As Washington and Rochambeau marched south, General Cornwallis had already taken up position in Yorktown, Virginia, a sleepy port town perched beside the York River. He had orders to establish a fortified base from which British operations in the south could be consolidated. But in choosing Yorktown, Cornwallis made a fateful error. The town had only one real escape route. By sea, on the 30th of August, Admiral de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake Bay right on schedule. He landed troops to reinforce the American Marquis de Lafayette, who had been shadowing Cornwallis's movements in Virginia. Then, the French fleet anchored across the bay's mouth, cutting off any chance of British naval support. But British command wasn't yet aware of the full danger. Admiral Thomas Graves was dispatched with a Royal Navy squadron to challenge de Grasse and rescue Cornwallis. On the 5th of September, 1781, the two navies collided in the Battle of the Chesapeake. It wasn't a decisive clash in terms of casualties or ships lost, but in strategic terms, it was a masterpiece. De Grasse's superior force repelled the British fleet and maintained control of the bay. For Cornwallis, the outcome was a disaster. No reinforcements would come by sea. No retreat was possible. He was trapped and Washington was still on the way. By mid-September, the Allied armies had completed their epic 450-mile march. Washington himself had paused briefly at his estate, Mount Vernon, his first visit in over 6 years. But the moment was fleeting. On the 14th of September, he arrived in Williamsburg and was greeted as a hero. Soldiers cheered. The French band played, and Lafayette, overwhelmed with emotion, embraced Washington like a long-lost father. Everything for once had gone to plan. Cornwallis still clung to hope. Perhaps he could hold out long enough for relief from Clinton in New York. Perhaps the French fleet would be forced to withdraw before winter. His instincts told him to stand fast. But Washington was not about to let the moment pass. On the 28th of September, 1781, the Allied forces moved the final miles and took up positions around Yorktown. The siege had begun. The Siege of Yorktown was not a romantic affair of bayonets and banners. It was a grim, grinding duel of attrition, trenches, and relentless cannon fire. Cornwallis had prepared well. 7 redoubts fortified the landward side of Yorktown. Linked by defensive earthworks and protected by artillery batteries, across the river at Gloucester Point, another battery dominated the area. Breaking through these defenses would not be quick or easy. The French, led by General Rochambeau and supported by skilled military engineers, recognized that time was the greatest enemy. Admiral de Grasse had already pledged to leave by late October. Once the French fleet departed, the British could return and reopen the river. A siege that dragged on risked turning triumph into collapse. So Washington, Rochambeau, and their engineers devised a formal siege, a systematic advance that would bring Allied artillery ever closer to the enemy's walls. It was a methodical, almost scientific form of warfare, and it demanded absolute discipline. On the 5th of October, under cover of night and rain, the Allies began digging the first siege trench, or parallel, just 600 yards from the British lines. The labor was grueling. Virginia soil was hard and dry. But The soldiers worked in silence and darkness. Washington himself broke ground with a ceremonial stroke of the pickaxe, a symbolic act to remind all watching that history was being written with every shovel of earth. By the 9th of October, the first American and French artillery batteries were ready. Again, Washington personally lit the fuse. The Allied cannonade erupted in a thunderous roar, joined by over 100 guns. For 3 straight days, the skies over Yorktown thundered as red-hot iron tore through homes, fortifications, and lives. The British suffered terribly. Bodies lay in the open. The harbor was a ruin. Even Cornwallis was forced to abandon his headquarters for a crude bunker. Desperate soldiers dug makeshift shelters in collapsed cellars and beneath overhangs along the riverbank. Yet Yorktown still held, and Washington knew the final blow must be delivered by infantry. 2 redoubts numbered 9 and 10 blocked the construction of a second, closer trench. Until these were captured, the siege could not proceed. On the night of the 14th of October, the Allies attacked. 400 French troops charged Redoubt 9. 400 Americans, led by Alexander Hamilton, stormed Redoubt 10. They carried unloaded muskets, relying instead on bayonets. The approach was silent until it wasn't. Flare rockets exploded in the sky. Muskets cracked. Shouts rang out. The battlefield lit up in chaos. The French fought their way through abatis and trenches, storming over the ramparts under heavy fire. They lost nearly 100 men but took the redoubt. The Americans, moving with speed and precision, struck from multiple directions. In hand-to-hand fighting, they overwhelmed the British defenders and seized Redoubt 10. In a single night, the fate of Yorktown was sealed. The capture of Redoubts 9 and 10 allowed Washington's engineers to complete the second siege, parallel this one even closer to Yorktown's battered walls. From these new positions, Allied gunners rained fire with merciless accuracy. The British lines buckled under the pressure. Cornwallis, hemmed in by land and sea, had run out of options. On the night of the 15th of October, in a last-ditch attempt to shift momentum, Cornwallis ordered a surprise counterattack. 350 hand-picked British soldiers crept through the dark and stormed forward Allied positions. For a brief moment, it worked. Cannons were spiked. Trench disrupted. Panic spread. But the French, ever vigilant, responded swiftly. Reinforcements arrived, and the British were driven back. It was the only sortie Cornwallis would attempt. The Allied line was simply too strong. By now, the British general faced the one thing commanders fear most: time turning against them. The defenders were exhausted. Disease was spreading, and the town was reduced to rubble. British soldiers were living in holes, surviving off dwindling rations, waiting for a miracle that never came. And yet, Cornwallis still hesitated to surrender. Instead, he tried one more gambit. On the night of the 16th of October, he ordered his troops to cross the York River and attempt an evacuation to Gloucester Point, hoping to break out and escape north. But nature intervened. Just as the crossing began, a violent storm blew through the estuary. Boats capsized. Soldiers were scattered. Only a third of the force made it across before the winds made further movement impossible. That night, Cornwallis stared into the face of a storm, both literal and metaphorical. He knew he was beaten. And worse, he knew the world would be watching when he surrendered. At dawn on the 17th of October, 1781, after another punishing Allied bombardment, a lone British officer appeared atop the Yorktown defenses. In his hands was a white flag. Blindfolded, he was escorted through American lines to Washington's headquarters. There, he delivered a letter from Lord Cornwallis proposing a ceasefire and negotiations for surrender. The mood in the Allied camp was electrified. For the Americans, this was more than victory. It was validation. Washington had fought for 6 years, through defeat and deprivation, through frostbite and mutiny, through treachery and despair. Now, the British were at his feet. Still, Washington remained careful. He refused to meet with Cornwallis directly, the British general, in a final act of pride or shame, claimed illness and sent his second-in-command to surrender in his place. Washington, perhaps in silent contempt, also delegated the ceremonial acceptance to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. On the 19th of October, 1781, British troops over 8,000 strong marched between rows of American and French soldiers, their flags furled, their drums silent. Observers noted the British tried to maintain dignity, but there was no hiding the truth. An empire was crumbling. One American soldier, overcome with emotion, later wrote, "Every hat flew into the air. Every man shouted, 'America is ours.' And applause. Cornwallis's army was taken prisoner. British guns were surrendered. And just like that, the last major British force in North America ceased to exist. News of Yorktown's fall rippled across the world. In London, Prime Minister Lord North is said to have paced the room, then shouted, "Oh, God, it is all over." And so it was, though it would take 2 more years to negotiate the Treaty of Paris and formally end the war, the British government now faced the truth. The war could not be won. Parliament would never again send another large force to subdue the colonies. For France, Yorktown was a validation of its alliance and a costly one. For the American people, it was a deliverance. For George Washington, it was the finest hour of a long and bitter campaign. But the end of the war did not end the struggle. What came next was harder, forming a republic from the ruins of rebellion, maintaining unity in a fractious young nation, and building something that would last. Yorktown was not the end. It was the beginning of America's second war, the one for identity, stability, and survival. Yet as the guns fell silent and the redcoats marched away in defeat, a single truth echoed across the battlefield. Freedom, once seized, is never freely given back. And so the empire left, not with a treaty, but with silence. The Siege of Yorktown remains one of history's perfect storms, a convergence of military timing, diplomatic coordination, and pure audacity. Had de Grasse arrived later, had Cornwallis chosen a different town, had Washington hesitated a week longer, the war may have dragged on for years. The revolution may have collapsed. And yet, in the face of uncertainty, Washington gambled and won. It was his finest moment, and perhaps the last war he ever needed to fight. A few years later, the man who led an army would reject kingship and give power back to the people, something rare even among the victorious. The fields of Yorktown are quiet now. Grass covers the scarred earth. The river flows gently past the bluff where cannons once roared. But if you walk there and close your eyes, you might still feel it, the final breath of an empire and the first heartbeat of a nation. Because in history, battles end, but revolutions echo